What's going on, guys? Nathan here from Salty Productions, back again with another Magic the Gathering YouTube video. And today we have some upgraded technology. This is my first video with a green screen, and so I figured I would put in the background the art for Karn's Temporal Sundering, which is one of my favorite Magic the Gathering arts. Speaking of favorites, today we're going to be going over approximately 10 questions in no particular order, covering various favorites and least favorites throughout Magic the Gathering. Before I get into the video, I'd like to ask if you have any questions for me that you would like me to answer in an AMA. Drop those in the comments. I am looking to put together a sort of Mail Monday type of video where I can answer any of your questions. So feel free to drop those in the comments. And if you enjoy this type of content, please leave a like on the video and subscribe. I make content like this on the regular, so by subscribing, you can be sure to stay up to date. So with that out of the way, we can jump into the video here. Now I've put together about a dozen different questions that I figure would be fun to talk about, covering some of my least favorite and favorite things in Commander. And with that, you can sort of get an idea of what type of player that I am and what are my general thoughts about the format of Commander. So the first question here is, what is your favorite color combination to play? Generally, I find aggro decks to be the most fun to pilot and play, and I like aggro decks that have a few tricks up their sleeve. So I find that in drafts, I sort of default to green blue quite a lot, because often I find security in sort of the big creature bodies that green has and the ability to ramp out additional lands, while also adding blue as a way to draw cards to just keep playing fatties as long as they are in my hand. Also to pull a fast one, so you have sort of that gotcha component with your opponents, which is always fun to see. And so for that reason, I actually think Teamer is my favorite color combination to play. I really love green-red decks, Atali Primal Storm, just generating a ton of card advantage while also playing a big body. The different sorts of effects that green have, like Xenagos God of Revels, where you're just pumping your team, giving them haste, and just trying to swing out with as big of creatures as you can possibly make. With the blue component, you throw in a little bit of spell trickery. So in particular, which I will give you a hint is the answer to one of my questions later, but one of my favorite decks that I've built is a polymorph style deck, where you are playing cards like polymorph, where you turn essentially 1/1 tokens that you can produce for less than 1 mana into giant 10 mana, 11 mana bombs. And so that is super fun. And in general, Teamer is doing exactly what I want to be doing in any sort of mid-range style matchup. If we even sort of look at what Teamer embodies, if we look at Teamer Ascendancy, for example, this is just pure value in my eyes. 3-mana enchantment, creatures you control have haste, and whenever a creature with power 4 or greater ETBs under your control, you may draw a card. So this is just so emblematic of what I absolutely want to be doing in a game of Commander. I want to be playing big bodies, swinging with them, and then drawing more cards so I can play more big bodies next turn. So that's my perfect game of Commander. And then a close second would be Naya, with probably pretty heavy leaning on Selesnya, but you can sort of see the similarity there with the Gruul color pattern, really just relying on sort of an aggro big stompy strategy. And then Naya gives you the go wide tools and removal tools to be incredibly efficient on the defensive. So Naya is a little bit more toolbox, or actually no, less toolboxy, more on the aggro side. But I find Naya decks really compelling as well, because they typically want to be going wide and swinging out with a wider board. Our next question here is, what is your least favorite color combination to face? So if an opponent is going to be revealing their commander, what color combination do I least want to see appearing in the top right corner of their commander? And I think this is a pretty close match between Dimir, which is blue-black, and Azorius, which is white-blue. The reason why is that Dimir is just looking to do all of the things that I don't particularly like in games of Commander, as somebody who really likes to assemble a big creature board and just sort of run out a bunch of aggro creatures. Dimir is often looking to wipe the board, shut down your threats, while tutoring up usually some sort of a combo win con. I know there are obviously different ways that Dimir decks can go about. I've looked at building like an Anawan the Ruin Thief type of rogue tribal deck. So, you know, there's tribes that are in Dimir colors that I think are honestly fun to play against, but Dimir in particular particular just has that blue-black combination of drawing cards and tutoring, while also having just really solid defensive cards like Soul Shatter and Toxrill and things like that. So that's definitely number one. Followed by number two, Azorius is typically looking to do the same thing, but just in a different way by locking you down with various pieces, and they are known to sort of stall out in how they finish the game. So Azorius decks, not particularly quick, and they just sort of want to grind out card advantage while wiping the board or shutting down particular strategies. And so that's why I've taken in my particular Brago King Eternal brew, taken a more aggro strategy where the ETBs are either producing creature token bodies or pumping them up so that you can basically have an aggro strategy, but just disguised under a flicker strategy. So our next question is, what is your favorite color combination to brew? And this one took me a little bit of thinking because each color combination is very unique in how they want to close out the game, you know, depending on which strategy they bring to the table. So I'm a big fan of aggro strategies for playing, and so I feel like that's actually influencing my bias here a little bit. For that reason, I chose Naya as my favorite color combination to brew. The reason is that Naya very consistently wants to just be aggro and go wide and close out with combat-based damage. The way that they do this can be quite varied. I don't really like to be pigeonholed in terms of a strategy, but there's several Naya commanders that bring just a different take on the aggro strategy. So I pulled up EDH Rec's top Naya commanders just for fun to see what's popular in this color combination. And in order, the top 10 is Jisath, Sun's Avatar at 16,000 decks, Atla Palani Nesttender, Rin Siri Inseparable, which is Cat and Dog Tribal. I've built that one at 13,000 decks. Jetmir Nexus of Revels, which is a go wide strategy. I've also built at 10,000 decks. Pentlaza Sun Favored at 10,000 decks as well. I've built Pentlaza as well. Then there's Shalayan Halar, which is +1/+1 counters at 6,000 decks. Ginny Fey Jetmir Second, another token go wide strategy at 6,000. Voha Jaws of the Conclave, 6,000. Rocco Cabarati Caterer, which is kind of a toolboxy commander because it's just a tutor in the command zone, so that could be literally anything at about 6,000 decks as well. And then there is Hazazon Shaper of Sand at about 5,600 decks. And I believe this is as of the past 2 years or so. Out of those 10, I've actually built, let's see, 3 myself. Honestly, I love them all. I really love playing Pentlaza, which is a dinosaur tribal. It just gives you all kinds of free spells. Jetmir, I don't play as much because it's actually a very powerful commander, and so you have to sort of preface playing Jetmir with the fact that you're playing Jetmir. It's really kind of a power level 8, and it's very linear in its goals. And then Rin and Siri is just a great deck to hand, particularly anybody that's female that you might want to be getting into the game, because there's plenty of cute cat art in Magic the Gathering. So yeah, Naya is the answer to this question as my favorite color combination to brew, followed by Esper. I feel like Esper has a lot of different strategies going for it as well. You can play artifacts, you can play control, you can play go wide if you wanted to, you could play combo. There's all kinds of stuff, and Esper decks can be quite varied in how they want to win. So I do like that as well. Moving on, we have what is your least favorite color combination to brew? And that I can speak with experience. My most recent brewing attempt has been with my Greymund Avacyn Stalwart deck, which is mono white humans / hate bears / protection. I feel like mono white from a design perspective just doesn't have enough variation in strategies to be interesting to brew around. It typically seems that mono white decks are either go wide with weenies, angels, or some sort of hate bear strategy, and that's really all that they have going on for them. Also, white is just the worst in terms of, I guess card draw has gotten better for white over the years. It used to be where white was the worst color combination back in like 2014 because red at least had some discard and draw effects that affected card selection. But with the printing of cards like Welcoming Vampire, Takesha's Welcome, that tend to draw cards when weenies are made, that has made mono white better, but only for specifically the weenie strategy. If you look at card draw outside of a weenie strategy, it is severely lacking, and often just straight card draw effects on mono white mean you have to give opponents cards, which in Commander, depending on your power level, can be a death sentence. Although in casual Commander, I will say that it is more fun to play Secret Rendezvous if you're trying to win an ally or make somebody the arch enemy or something like that. So mono white, I just feel like it does not have enough variation in its strategies to be particularly interesting. And for the same reason, I think a close second for mono white is Golgari. Really just green-black decks want to reanimate creatures, and that's pretty much the end of it. There's like Karth the Lion decks, which have a Super Friend strategy, but ultimately, if we pull up, let's pull up some Golgari commanders here and see how many of the top commanders are focused on a reanimation strategy. So Lathril, Blade of the Elves, is an elf go-wide commander. Chatterfang, also a go-wide commander, more focused on just token generation in general. So Marin, Clan of Neltoth, is a reanimator commander. Dina, Soul Steeper, also kind of a reanimation commander. Shelob, Child of Ungoliant, Spider Commander, so not necessarily reanimation, I think. But then there's the Gitrog monster, Skullbriar, which is also reanimation / +1/+1 counters. Grist, the Hunger Tide, lots of reanimation there. Baba La Saga, sacrifice and reanimation. And then Hepatra, Vizier of Poisons, which is -1/-1 counters. That is interesting. So I don't know, Golgari also just does not excite me. It typically takes some sort of special effect in Golgari to convince me to build a Golgari deck. And now that I think about it, I don't think I actually have a single Golgari deck. I do have Abzan with Carador, and that sort of scratches the itch for like aristocrats or reanimation type of effects. But yeah, Golgari would be my second least favorite color combination to brew. Next question, we have, what is your favorite commander deck? And as hinted at the beginning of this video, it is my polymorph deck. I just love the action, the just pure dopamine effect of going, all right, everybody, let's see what comes off of the top of my deck with this polymorph. Just the action of like flipping over your deck and starting to like deal out the cards to see like, all right, there's like 12 creatures in here. We're going to hit one eventually, and they're all absolutely massive. So that's super fun to just flip up an Atali for huge card advantage, or I don't know, something like a Jin Gitaxias to absolutely shut down the table. I've definitely had a Jin Gitaxias out on turn 4 before, which has been a ton of fun because your opponents basically just don't have any answers to get rid of it once their hand is discarded. So that was a ton of fun, but definitely polymorph. And then I also have a budget version of that polymorph. Nowadays, if you were to get the cards at near mint, it would be around $100, but if you like really skimped and bought the cheapest cards from like TCG Player, you could get it down to 50. So that is the polymorph deck. Next question, we have, what commander deck do you play the least? Rogue Tribal. It's just a deck I never reach for because I know kind of how it wants to win, and it's really just not that different from any other sort of tribal go-wide deck. Rogues tend to want to be very evasive, and then you just pump them up, and you just hope that you're not board wiped. So I think it's called a Kami's deck. Kami's Obscura Oculus says whenever you attack, target attacking creature can't be blocked this turn. It connives. Then choose another attacking creature with lesser power. That creature gains double strike until end of turn. And I feel like the complicated aspect of this card makes me not want to play it as well, because every time that something happens with it on the field, I have to think about how I want to actually resolve that trigger. Yeah, rogues are just not particularly different. That really makes me want to reach for the deck. Followed by my mono green elf deck. One of my friends in our current commander pod has an elf deck, which I built for him like as high power as I could make it without being CEDH. And so that essentially is a very, very strong deck. I'd say between an 8 or a 9 power level, where it really just wants to win by like turn 4 with gigantic elves, or in infinite mana, pumping everybody for infinite power toughness with Azuri. And elves are just so linear. I mean, it's literally just play land, play elves, play more elves, and then swing with a huge, huge board. It's just the same stuff every time. So for that reason, I actually leave elves kind of just in the basement when we have our commander knights. Then there's my wizard reanimator deck. I don't play that a ton because pretty much every effect that the deck is running is like a looting effect, and that makes you have like 10 micro decisions over the course of every turn, and so it's mentally taxing the more you play that deck. And then I would say finally, for power level reasons, my Joda Legends deck and also my the first Sliver tribal deck, both are just so aggressive on board, and they're really at kind of that 8 level. Typically our pod hangs around a lower power level, around maybe like a 6 or a 7, so Joda tends to stay in the deck box as well because he just does too much. All right, in our next question, what are the top 3 commanders that you'd hate to see cross the table? So this is not a favorite, least favorite questions, but I figured I would, rank a few commanders that are just absolutely abysmal to play against. So the first one I think is Yuriko. I think that this was a mistake in design. Anyway, Commander Ninjutsu should definitely be eroded in the rules to essentially force you to pay the commander decks to activate that ability. And honestly, I wouldn't even mind if that was applied to other commanders like Derevi, which aim to cheat the commander decks. And having gone against Yuriko decks, it is just so frustrating because nobody wants to use removal on the little, 1/1s that aim to be unblocked. And if only one of those gets through, the deck basically just gets to do its thing. It's also very consistent because Yuriko runs a lot of top deck manipulation. So you want to put obviously like a Blightsteel Colossus on the top, so it always draws what it wants. The commander is just a mistake in design. I mean, let's be frank. There should be a rule change to modify Yuriko, but alas, I don't think we're going to ever see that. But I would like to see it very much. And then the second here, I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm just going to say all of the Eminence commanders. I've built all of them except for the cat one. But I think that, well, actually, okay. So the Eminence commanders that are busted in the Eminence ability. So the cat one is fair. Sidar Jabari is pretty fair. It's basically a free loot every turn. The Dragon, Edgar, Inala, all of these commanders are just frankly, again, a mistake in design by giving the player free value. In 2024, it's almost like cards just come with no downside. And actually now in the brewing process, we've really begun to compare like, okay, what are the good cards compared to the great cards? Like there are no downsides ever anymore. It's just always like, how do you like it's choosing between chocolate frosting or vanilla frosting essentially is how brewing goes today. It's just free value. I mean, the fact that they banned Lutri because it's essentially just a free companion every time for the colors that can run it, that should say something, yet we keep the Eminence commanders legal. So that just doesn't make sense to me, but the ban list has never been consistent, and I'd like to see that change as well. Our next question here is, are you a Timmy, Johnny, or a Spike? Now, for those of you who don't know, these are basically player personifications that R&D sort of uses to simplify different ways that people like to win the game. So I pulled up the actual official article from Wizards of the Coast website. Timmys ultimately like to play big creatures and big spells, and they just generally like to win in big, splashy ways. So the article here says Timmy wants to smash his opponents. He likes his cards to be impressive, and he enjoys playing big creatures and big spells. So that's sort of what Timmy is looking to do. Johnny, on the other hand, wants to win on his own terms and views Magic as a sort of self-expression or a way to express creativity. So Johnnies want to typically be playing some sort of jank strategy or strategy that is sort of outside the box for particular commanders. And so playing specific brews is an opportunity for Johnnies to sort of show off their creativity in how they want to win. So typically they want to win with their own creative design, which is maybe perhaps off the beaten path. And then Spike is very win focused. Spike's play to win. They want this to be as efficient as possible. They will net deck. They will borrow other players' decks. And so Spikes want to basically be playing like Thassa's Oracle, Demonic Consultation combos to close out the game as quickly as possible. With that explanation out of the way, I am definitely a Timmy. I love just to see a giant board state, have giant creatures on the board that my opponents are just frantically trying to come up with answers to remove, and to just sort of have all of my cards out in front of me on the battlefield is so satisfying. And definitely board wipes will just ruin a Timmy's day, and that's okay. I've accepted the fact that board wipes are big sad. The payoff there is that you're just this oppressive force on the battlefield, playing Galtas left and right and playing, giant 8/8 tramplers. And so I love that kind of thing. And I think that's probably harkens back to when I initially started playing Magic the Gathering. One of the decks so the first Magic the Gathering deck that I ever picked up and played that I remember, I think that was for Commander. That was the red Commander 2014 deck with Derevi at the helm. And I remember the deck just did not work that well. It just sort of made mana. And when I took it apart at a later point in time, looking at the deck list, it was like, this has no way to close out the game. Like, this red deck will literally just make mana until the cows come home. And it had no actual board presence. It just sort of looped artifacts. I was intrigued by the mono green elves deck because it just made a lot of elves, and it tried to pump up elves, and it was the first time I had seen a Beastmaster Ascension be triggered for the +5/+5, and with that I was immediately interested in green and just generating a giant board presence. So I think that sort of is the origin of my Timminess, but yeah, Timmy for sure. Our next question here: what commanders have intrigued you, but you've never felt the urge to build their decks? I think that I'm going to just reference commanders in the past 6 months or so. Voha, Jaw of the Conclave, I think takes the cake for me on this one, where Voha, let me actually pull this up really quickly, and I'm sure with the magic of editing it will just appear on screen. Voha, Jaws of the Conclave is a 5-mana Naya commander, 5/5, Vigilance, Trample, and Ward 3 for some reason. Whenever Voha, Jaws of the Conclave attacks, put X +1/+1 counters on each creature you control, where X is the number of elves you control. Draw a card for each wolf you control. So basically people just build this as an elf ball deck, and I am just so uninterested in any sort of elf ball deck. In fact, if we look at their EDA trick page, Elves has 5,000 decks, while Wolf Tokens has 222 decks. So like 90% of these decks are elf ball, and I have seen elf ball perform its work. I have played elf ball decks, and they just do not interest me in any way, shape, or form. If somebody unveils their commander as a Zuri Renegade leader, and I'm not, if my friend Levi sees this, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about out in the wild. If I find that I'm playing against an elf ball deck, it's like, oh yeah, okay, you're going to make elves and then you're going to overrun and do the thing. I've seen this game plan unfold definitely dozens of times. I've seen elf decks do their thing, and it's just not interesting anymore. That followed by Sauron the Dark Lord. Sauron the Dark Lord is a Grixis commander, 6 mana, 7/6. Ward, sack a legendary artifact or legendary creature. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, a Masterworks 1. Whenever an army you control deals combat damage to a player, the ring tempts you, and whenever the ring tempts you, you may discard your hand if you do draw 4 cards. So Sauron does a lot of things. I just think that the most effective way to build a Sauron the Dark Lord deck is to build it as aristocrats, and I am just kind of tired of playing aristocrats and playing against aristocrats. I've seen how they win, and their win method just isn't that interesting to me, in terms of you play the Zulapar Cutthroat and then you have a free sack outlet, and then you loop zombies, or in this case I guess orc armies whenever an opponent casts a spell. So essentially this translates to, with a Zulapar Cutthroat on the field and a sack outlet, whenever an opponent casts a spell they each lose 1 life, and so the play pattern there is pretty obvious and just not as interesting to me. And then I think number 3 on this list, I'll actually dip into my third option here, is Miram Sentinel Worm. I have died to Miram decks a lot. it's just not interesting. It's the epitome of the I'm going to play this threat, and if you don't answer it, you lose type of deck. So that is just not as interesting as well. Also, I think this is also influenced by the design decision around to put Ward 3 onto Miram. It has Ward 2. And so I just think that when you have such powerful effects like this, you have to give it the downside by leaving out the protection. And so I just don't think it was designed very well. And if you got rid of the ward, it would be able to be interacted with. So that is my third commander that is intrigued me in terms of the value it brings, but I will never build the deck because I have died to it and I'm a little bit bitter. All right, next up we have, on average, how long does it take you to build a deck from start to finish? And I think this is a simple answer. It's between, I think, 4 to 6 hours, depending on the complexity of the strategy. I'd say on average, probably about 5 hours per deck. If I have to do a lot of custom searching in like Scryfall, that's going to add a lot of time. And also, cutting cards can be a very lengthy part of the process. I feel like most of the time spent is really like, okay, what are the cards I want? Is like a third of the time you get to like 120 cards that you absolutely love, and then the like 2/3 of the rest of the time is spent cutting down to get to 100, because you evaluate like every slot for its absolute efficiency, and trying to find ways that all the cards work with each other's takes a lot of mental horsepower. And so I find that, and then you have to build out. Personally, like what I do is I just build like a land analysis to see like, okay, are all my lands, am I hitting my colors correctly? How many utility lands do I have? How many lands are entering tapped and untapped? And then you do your mana curve analysis, and then if your different permanent types matter, so like in an artifact deck, how many artifacts am I running? And so you might make little microscopic tweaks to say like, okay, I want this effect, but it has to be an artifact, and so that leads down to another custom search and Scryfall or something like that. So I think about 5 hours is probably the average time. Next, we have, if you could ban one card in Commander, what would it be? And I think the easy answer here, and I'm going to cheat a little bit, I'm going to say just generally all fast mana, particularly Soul Ring and Mana Crypt. I honestly think that the Rules Committee just needs to rip the Band-Aid off and completely ban Soul Ring and Mana Crypt. The fact that Soul Ring is illegal is just a complete grandfather from the olden days, a grandfather into the format, and the fact that Wizards will basically print a Soul Ring in every precon, but what they need to do is tell Wizards, or even if the rules committee were to move back to an internal Wizards team, they could work with Wizards to say like, okay, on this date we're going to stop printing Soul Ring in precons, so that then 6 months after we stop printing it, as it starts to creep up in price, you just ban it, so that people have an expectation, or you say like, hey, we're going to be banning it on this date like a year from now, so all of the metas can have time to adjust, and factor that in. And the fact that Soul Ring is still allowed is kind of ridiculous. I mean, like the on par rate, what's considered fair, right, with Arcane Signet is a 2 mana generate 1, and to have a 1 mana generate 2 is just like so obviously overpowered, and Mana Crypt's even worse. The only reason why Mana Crypt is not considered in the same conversations is because of price, or rather why it doesn't see as much play. So that's even more of an egregious example, but Soul Ring, the fact that it's only like $1.50, makes it so much more viable for any sort of build. And so it's just WotC's printing of Soul Ring, and their continued desire to have fast mana in their precons, that is driving this decision to keep it unbanned. And so I think the band-aid needs to be ripped off. And then I'm going to actually cheat and give you another answer here. The second card is for sure Rhystic Study. I don't like the play pattern of Rhystic Study because it slows down the game by forcing people to resolve a trigger every time a spell is cast. And Rhystic Study is so immensely powerful for what it does, and it is silent. So those two things combined together, I think, make this card just absolutely should be on the ban list, because you will lose to decks that are running or Rhystic Study, but you will not know that it was Rhystic Study that actually killed you. I think I was watching an episode of I Hate Your Deck with Lynch, and it's quite a popular Commander gameplay series. And one player had a Rhystic Study on the field for essentially the whole game, and they won with a combo. I think it was like a no, it wasn't Consecrated Sphinx, but it was some sort of immense value synergy play. And the reason why that you don't what actually killed the table was some, big creature or damage effect. But what really enabled that is the Rhystic Study, drawing lands, guaranteeing land drops, guaranteeing interaction, and even free interaction if you have it, and just giving you more fuel. So definitely Rhystic Study is the most powerful card draw engine in the format, and I think should be put on the ban list. So generally, I think I'm more of the position that the ban list should be managed much more aggressively. Or not at all. I mean, preference number one is to have a really aggressive ban list, to say okay, even I would say even okay, Glacial Chasm, any sort of land that has a very powerful effect, since lands are so sort of taboo to interact with, be much more aggressive about which lands appear on the ban list, things like Glacial Chasm, things like Field of the Dead, and I think these card draw engines like Rhystic Study, there's I don't know, even I think even Thassa's Oracle in general should be banned, because it just is the most efficient way to win the game in the entire format. So it's I really prefer to have an active ban list that is informed by data and very data driven, and I think that there needs to be ultimately some funding or money put allocated to that team to run various sort of data collection exercises to inform what are the actual most problematic cards in the format, and then also factor in your community's opinion as well. So it maybe hold regular polls for what are some of the saltiest cards that people think that should be banned. I mean, hell, ban Winter Orb, ban Stasis, get rid of all of the ridiculous stacks pieces, and yes, the meta will shift, but if regardless of the meta shifting, if we recognize that no matter what happens when a card is banned or unbanned, the meta will shift. If you reason that as long as we're dropping the power level to a power level that more people like on average and lead to better play experiences, then who cares what the meta is or what the predominant winning strategy is? As long as it's varied and that people are having fun in the format, I think that's the ultimate goal. And so ultimately, I think that there just needs to be more data informed decisions for the rules committee. But that's kind of a separate tangent, and we'll just move on to the next question here, which is, if you could unban one card in Commander, what would it be? And this one I think is pretty easy. It would be Emrakul, the Aeon's Torn, which is the 15 mana Eldrazi, which is a 15/15 Emrakul, the Aeon's Torn, can't be countered. When you cast Emrakul, take an extra turn after this one. It has flying, protection from colored spells, and Annihilator 6. And finally, when Emrakul is put into a graveyard from anywhere, its owner shuffles his or her graveyard into his or her library. So I understand that Emrakul is definitely one of those, great reanimation targets. There are certain decks that are built to ultimately just ramp out enough mana to cast Emrakul. The fact that it doesn't require waste mana is somewhat interesting, because it was designed before sort of waste mana was incorporated. I think if this was changed to force players to pay wastes into it, then you couldn't you can't ritual into it like a mana geyser or something like that, because once it hits the field, it's really really powerful in terms of how it stifles players, and the play pattern is generally just very unfun for one particular player until they're dead, because you essentially can't interact with it. But of all the things on the ban list, I think this is the least egregious, because ultimately because it is 15 mana. If you look at certain, so you can almost look at this as almost like a combo deck for any deck that wants to run and actually cast Emrakul. Ultimately, it's a 2-card combo. So like if you have a Ritual that's your first piece and Emrakul, which is your second piece, is that any worse for losing the game compared to something like a Demonic Consultation Thassa's Oracle combo, or any sort of time like infinite turns combo, or anything like any sort of artifact combo that like a Brea deck would be running? I just don't think that losing to Emrakul is the big boogeyman that it perhaps once was, compared to how fast the Commander meta is today. And so for that reason, I think Emrakul the Aeon's Torn would be my one unbanning, followed closely by Coalition Victory. I do think that there are ways to cheese the Coalition Victory, which would and I generally don't like the win the game out of nowhere type of effects, but Coalition Victory, you at least have a few hoops to jump through, similar to Emrakul. So it's for that reason that, like, okay, as long as you put up a few roadblocks on the path to victory, like that's relatively fair for decks nowadays. So I think those two would be my two unbannings. And our final question here, if you could give one tip to all Commander players, what would it be? And this one I had to think for a while. And I think I landed on so I was thinking, like, okay, over the course of my brewing experience, what has actually added the most fun to my experience across my different decks that I brew? And I think the answer is to play more MDFC lands instead of ramp. Oftentimes ramping is really just paying mana to get your land drop into play if you are short on lands. And so I think that quite often you can simply hit your land drops by playing more tapped lands with the options to have a spell on the backside to actually be useful in the late game. I think that MDFCs occupy a very important part of your mana base, in that they are the tapped portion of your mana base for the non-mythic ones. However, they ultimately, like, I'd still rather play a tapped MDFC land than play Rampant Growth, because they do the same thing ultimately. It doesn't color fix you, as well as Rampant Growth, but in situation where you played Rampant Growth, you paid 2 mana to play a tapped land. So yes, you do want to be multi-spelling sooner, but I feel like in Commander, oftentimes, like, you definitely don't want to be missing land drops. So if you run a higher proportion of lands, let's say between 38 and 40, and cut your ramp pieces down to perhaps like 9 or 10, I think that would improve all decks functioning pretty much across the board, because you are not land flooded as much, you are not mana screwed as much, and you are able to actually just play lands instead of having to ramp. And the asterisk there is that you can be doing something else on those earlier, like turn 1 or turn 2s, for example. Like self-milled decks don't always want to be ramping on turn 1 or 2. Instead, they want to be playing undead butlers to fill their graveyard. So I think that MDFCs can really smooth out the way that a deck plays, no matter what color combination you're in. So for this question, play more MDFCs. And that wraps up the list of questions for today. So if you have any strong opinions for any of the questions that I've covered today, leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. And I read pretty much every comment, and I'll even respond to comments as I see them. So yeah, let me know your thoughts on all these questions, where you stand, and maybe we can start an intelligent debate in the comments below. But with that, I would like to conclude the video here. So thank you all for watching. Once again, if you like this video, leave a like on it and subscribe if you like this type of content, and hopefully I will see you all in the next one.